Hello everyone and welcome to the channel. In today's video, I will be demonstrating the full gold crown performed on Kilgore tooth number 30. The burr we are using for the occlusal reduction is the 55 carbide Fisher burr. You may also use a 56 or a 57 carbide Fisher burr. Occlude the typodont to ensure that the maxillary cusps fit the mandibular grooves. Take the angle from the opposing cusp. Bring that angle down and begin to create a depth angle on the cusps and grooves. Use minimal pressure to reduce. Gently round cusps and grooves to the embrasures. Reduction of the functional cusp bevel, also referred to as the A-plane. The functional cusp bevel is located on the buccal cusps of the mandibular teeth. The bevel, or A-plane, is approximately 3.5 millimeters wide, extending gingivally from the tip of the cusps to the occlusal 1/3 of the buccal surface. Once the angle is established, we can change the burr direction by pointing the burr towards the cheek. This will allow us to create a measurable depth plane that extends along the bevel. The A-plane will eventually extend into proximally and connect with the central groove. Use minimal pressure to reduce and gently round cusps from the grooves to the embrasures. We may also take the angle from the matching adjacent cusp, which is a 45-degree angle. Occlude the typodont to ensure that the maxillary cusps fit the mandibular grooves. Gently round cusps and grooves to the embrasures. We continue reducing until our ledge measures 1 millimeter to 1.2. Leave a little more room to reduce for when we finalize the occlusal reduction. Now we are ready to reduce the B-plane, the mesial buccal cusp. Take the angle from the matching adjacent cusp, keep the burr parallel to the ridge, point the burr and follow the central groove. Reduce half of the cusp at a time. Now we can reduce the distal buccal cusp. Take the angle from the matching adjacent cusp, position the burr from the distal and slightly tangent to the adjacent tooth. Keep the burr parallel to the ridge, point the burr and follow the central groove. Reduce half of the cusp at a time. Now we can reduce the distal cusp. Angle the burr slightly tangent to the adjacent tooth. Take the angle from the matching adjacent cusp. Point the burr and follow the central groove. Reduce the cusp flat and then round the ridge. Here you can see I'm using a 1mm ball burnisher to measure the reduction at the central groove. Reduction of the lingual cusps, the non-functional cusps, also referred to as the C-plane. Starting with the mesial lingual cusp, we reduce half of the cusp at a time, placing the burr parallel to the ridge, pointing in the central groove. Gently reduce the cusp from the occlusal down to the central groove, creating a measurable ledge of 1 mm to 1.2 mm. Reduce half of the cusp to the marginal ridge, reduce the other half out through the lingual groove. Reduction of the distal lingual cusp. We reduce half of the cusp at a time. Place the burr parallel to the ridge, pointing towards the central groove. Gently reduce the cusp from the occlusal down to the central groove, creating a measurable ledge 1 mm to 1.2 mm. Reduce half of the cusp to the marginal ridge. Reduce the other half out through the lingual groove. Now we move on to the proximal axial reduction. Tilt the patient's head away from you. Look directly at the proximal area. Be aware that the gingiva rises within the embrasures. Proximal reduction should be between 1 mm and 1.2 mm. For this step, I'm using a thin chamfer burr, the 6878K 012 diamond. We want to start with our gingival margin a little more than 1/2 mm above the gingiva. Position the burr to be parallel to the adjacent tooth. Cut using the whole diameter of the burr. Cut straight back to the lingual. Keep the gingival margin up. Create a 1/2 mm chamfer. Position the burr to be parallel to the adjacent tooth. Keep the gingival margin up. Cut using the whole diameter of the burr. Create a 1/2 mm chamfer. Cut straight back to the lingual. The facial axial reduction. In order to reduce the axial surface, we look along the wall. This allows us to see the taper, the tip of the burr, and along the wall. The burr I'm using is a medium-sized chamfer 878K 0.014 diamond. Axial reduction is 1 mm to 1.2 mm with a 1/2 mm chamfer. Keep the gingival margin a little more than 1/2 mm above the gingiva. The burr has a natural tapered shape that will give us a 3-degree taper. Keep the burr vertical to the long axis of the tooth. You may also take the angle from the middle third of the adjacent tooth. Gently reduce by rounding the axial surface. Be careful not to taper or tilt the burr away from the axis of the tooth. Now we place the secondary plane, which is located on the occlusal 1/3 and the middle 1/3 of the buccal surface. Place the secondary plane just below the functional cusp bevel. Lingual axial reduction. In order to reduce the axial surface, we look along the wall. This allows us to see the taper, the tip of the burr, and along the wall. The burr I'm using is a medium-sized chamfer 878K .014 diamond. Axial reduction is 1 mm to 1.2 mm with a 0.5 mm chamfer. Keep the gingival margin a little more than a 0.5 mm above the gingiva. As we approach the far distal lingual, we need to change the patient's position and use the mirror. As we approach the far mesial lingual, we need to change the patient's position and use the mirror. Place a secondary plane on the occlusal 1/3 of the lingual surface. Using the 55 burr, extend the A-plane into proximally to connect with the central groove. A thin bevel should be placed on the functional and non-functional cusps. Make sure to finalize the preparation by checking our measurements, taper, chamfer margins, and all-around function.